Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I appreciate everybody joining us for our fourth of a series of 6 webinars. Keep in mind, we have 2 more after this one. Today's is part 1 of a 2-part series on hand sanding. Today's is hand sanding 101. I'm Curtis Hicks with Uneeda. I'm going to host the webinar, and we have by audio our hand sanding specialist or hand sanding technician, Sherry Jessen, who will also be joining us. The next webinar is June 30th, and that is the second part to this one. And that one is going to be the ultimate finish, and it's going to get even more in depth into how to get that great finish. A lot more of talking about sanding in between coats and things of that nature. And then our 6th and final webinar of this series will be on July 22nd, and that one will be all about about solid surface finishing. Regarding questions, we're going to get about halfway through this, and I'll take the first set of questions if there are any, and then we'll move on and answer questions again at the end. So let's get started. Hand sanding 101. These are the things we're going to be discussing today. Hand sanding best practices, wide belt sanding briefly because it does feed into hand sanding, lighting the hand sanding area, random orbital sanding best practices, 3x4 sanders, swirl marks, grit uses, and foam abrasives. So let's get rolling. Hand sanding best practices. Wide belt sanding will play into that, lighting, the start and stop rule of sanding, keeping the sander flat, sanding pressures, sander motions, hook and loop disc and where they play into this process. And you're going to learn something very interesting about non-woven maroon and gray cut sheets today. I hope you stick through that part of it because it's going to be very interesting that can help you fix a very critical problem in hand sanding. I'm going to cover the wide belt sanding aspects of it, and the reason I wanted to include this is not everyone on this webinar is going to have a wide belt sander or a drum sander. Some of you that do have wide belt sanders and drum sanders, you're only using those to calibrate. So maybe you're stopping at 80 grit or 120. This little section here is geared a little more for those of you who are taking your wide belt sanders all the way out to your final finish. And what you're hoping to do there is to get your finish there and not do as much hand sanding. So some things to keep in mind if you are going to finish with a 180, 220 grit and then go to your hand sanding. Number 1 is your correct grit sequence. And the reason that I mentioned that is you really want to finish as fine as you can while you're still taking all the stock removal that you need to get. But pay close attention to that because you do want to finish out as fine as you possibly can if you're going to have to do a lot of hand sanding afterwards. So where that's going to really come into play is for people that are doing 5-piece doors because you have stiles and rails and face frames. There's a lot of cross grain that's put into 5-piece doors and face frames as it goes through your wide belt sander. So correct stock removals are very critical, especially on that last head. On your last head in a 180 or 220 grit, the optimal stock removal on that would be about 2/1000, max at 4. But just keep in mind, the deeper that cross grain scratch is going in from that wide belt sander, the harder it's going to be to get out by hand. Now, finishing with silicon carbide, if anybody watched the wide belt seminar, and then last seminar we did was a lot about abrasive grains. Silicon carbide is an excellent grain for finishing. Aluminum oxide is the most common, and that's what you're using most of the time. And that's good because you get a little more life. Silicon carbide is not going to quite give you the life because it cracks and breaks down a lot quicker than aluminum oxide, but it leaves a very soft cross grain scratch. And what we really want to focus on with the wide belt is getting that softer scratch. Minimal pressure and belt tension help a lot with that as well. Anything we can do to not have a shock on that part as it's going through will help lighten that scratch. And our philosophy at Uneeda is go to paper as quick as you can. We certainly understand that on a lot of applications, you need a nice durable cloth on that first head for calibrating, but the quicker you can get to paper, the better your finish is going to look and soften up that cross grain because paper always finishes better. Now we're going to get into more all the hand sanding aspects of this. And Sherry, I know you're on with us and we really appreciate your time being here today. I go into a lot of shops and I see lots of different lighting, different kinds of bulbs. I see them placed in different places. Tell us a little bit about lighting and how critical it is to this whole hand sanding process.
Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, great to be with everybody today. Lighting is a huge part of our hand sanding. And the reason I say that is because coming off of that wide belt line, like Curtis was saying, we have a cross grain scratch that we need to remove. And to remove it, we use the random orbitals to sand. Most times we bring in new people, we put them on the hand sanding table. It seems to be the first stop for anyone coming into the wood shop. One of the problems is that a lot of times the people training them haven't been trained properly, or they've been doing it the same way and they have some bad habits, and it ends up passing on to other people. One of the main things is that they really don't know what they're sanding out. And so they continue to over sand. One of the problems is they can't see it. When you light a table from the top, it doesn't show all the defects or all the sanding marks or any lines that are left from the wide belt sander. It's almost like a shadow. In the past, we had the big Carter lights. They were, if you've ever stood by one, you know what I'm talking about. It's tremendously hot. I mean, it's just unbelievably hot standing there, and it casts a shadow and you can't see it. So if you'll drop an LED light on, go across the workpiece, you will pick up all the different sanding lines. And so what we've started doing is, advising people, hey, get one of the LED light bars. You can get them, plug them in, mount them on your hand sanding table, and light that hand sanding table up so that they can see that cross grain and take it out and stop before they over sand and get to the swirls.
And one more question, Sherry. I sometimes see people using ultraviolet light. I know a lot of times they do that in a booth. Can you tell us what the reason for that is?
A lot of times you'll have glue that, for the miter joints or in defects or something, and the ultraviolet light will actually cause the glue to kind of glow or shine, and you can actually pick it up easier and sand it off. Once it gets to the finish room, if it's still there, it's going to be a mess in the finish room. It's not going to sand. I'm sorry, it's not going to stain.
Perfect. I started in coated abrasives, to tell you how old I am, about 28 years ago. And I think the first 4 words I learned was start on, stop off. I know that's been shoved down all of our throats for years, but Sherry, why is it really that important?
When we start a sander on the workpiece, we have a nice, flat, even surface, and our hand is in control of the sander. If we start it off the workpiece and we place it on, it's going to catch the wood or grab the wood, and it's going to shoot that sander across, causing a nice long pigtail. Same concept when you stop the sander on. If you stop the sander on, you're going to unconsciously put pressure to stop the rotation. And when you do, that's going to cause a digging effect or a sanding effect that will cause long-term sanding issues all the way through the finish. You'll be able to see that sanding line.
Thank you. Now, I'm guilty of this. I know no one watching this can deny that they haven't been in a plant and seen someone in that picture on the left using that 5-inch DA sander like it's an angle grinder. And I know what they're doing. They're trying to get out a pretty tough defect. And really, what's wrong with that, Sherry? Why is this a problem?
Well, as we talked about, when we come off the wide belt sander, a lot of times they'll have, chatter marks or lines or something coming off of there. And naturally, you want to get those out, and you think the easiest way is to tip the sander. I've even seen people put, a soft edge backup pad on the sander and thinking that, oh, well, I can tip it. When you do that, you actually dig almost like a ditch in the wood. The minute you put stain on it, you're going to see it.
Even if you can't see it in the white wood, you're going to see it when you color.
Right. You're going to see it in the color. You're going to see almost like a divot or a ditch. I call it a ditch, but it's like a divot in the wood where you dug in and you got a low spot in the wood, and you can't fix that.
So keep it flat.
Keep it flat.
A few things on here I want to discuss. Sure, if you could fill us in a little bit about proper sanding patterns, because a lot of times I go in and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to how people are sanding. And is pressure important? And then I know you have some very deep opinions on hook and loop versus PSA.
Yeah, I do. Just through the years, I've seen people migrate towards PSA over hook and loop, generally because of cost. It was more cost prohibitive to make a PSA disc than it was to make the hook and loop disc. The problem is that PSA on wood is not our friend. They say 70% of all swirls created by are created by PSA discs. And the reason being is that it's pressure sensitive adhesive. We melt glue, we pour it on the back of a jumbo roll, we roll it either up on itself or we put a liner on it. You can see the liners on there. And then we bring it in and we punch it into discs, and then we slap it on a sander and we heat that glue back up. I know you can clean the backup pads, but you're not getting all the residue off. Anything that gets trapped between the sander, a backup pad, and the disc is a projectile, and it becomes a projectile that you shove down into the wood, causing the swirls. With hook and loop discs, a couple of things happen. Heat is not our friend with sanding. It's not good for the sander, and it's not good for the abrasive, and it's definitely not good for the wood. And what ends up happening with a hook and loop disc, you've got a little bit of air running between the disc and the backup pad. And also, if something gets trapped in there, you're not using it as a projectile to shove it down into the wood. So it gives it a little bit of cushion there. When we're sanding on doors, on the rails and stiles after they come out of the wide belt sander, you try to take the cross grain out. My general rule of thumb is twice around the racetrack, meaning we go around the rails and stiles, 2 times. We may spend a little bit more time on the stiles going across it, but we don't want to be a broken pattern. If we start across, we want to go all the way across, because if you start and stop in midway and you kind of break up your sanding pattern, you're going to start to see lines and shadows, or what we call cornrows, and we want to eliminate that. Another big problem that I see a lot of is people want to shove down on the sander. The sander has 2 rotations. It's a random orbital sander, so it's rotating, and then on top of rotating, you got that loopy orbit that it's doing. When you shove down and put too much pressure, you actually stop part of the rotation, and that causes big problems in your sanding. It will cause to dig hole, the shape of the disc into the wood. It can cause pigtails. It can cause a number of different sanding lines, and you'll see them throughout the wood process. It's easier to take those out and going into a paint situation because you're not having to completely remove them. But if you're going into stain, it can ruin a door. It can eliminate the use of that door completely. It would have to be remade.
And regarding the sanding patterns, I know you're going twice around the racetrack on a stile and rail. On a 5-piece door, you're going to have the insert. How do you have a specific way you like to sand the insert, like any particular pattern, or can you give us any advice on that?
On a raised panel door, I try to go, up and down and then side to side, only once each way. But I do a shaker door with a 3x4, so it's a little bit different in the way I run my pattern. With a random orbital, you want to go up and down and then side to side, because you don't want to have a cornrow, like I said, where you can see where the sander marks are and it passes. You want it to be an even pattern, and you want to blend it all.
Okay, thank you. 3 items in this picture we're going to talk about. Sherry's going to give us some info on them. The top one is a 3x4 sander, which is becoming a hugely important tool in hand sanding. The picture on the bottom left, it's kind of white and standing up there, that is an interface pad. And the picture on the bottom right with the multi-holes is a pad saver, which may be new to a lot of you. And of course, it comes in different patterns. But Sherry, tell us a little bit about these items, and then also your opinion on where film back sheets fit into all of this.
Right. So the 3x4 sander has really become a popular sander, especially with the amount of shaker doors, like I said a while ago, or on the last slide, that they've become hugely important in that aspect of sanding. And the reason being is that we can go corner to corner. We can drop in a drawer box and go corner to corner. We can get into areas where before, when we had a round sander, we would get in, but then we actually have to go to a hand sanding pad or a piece of sandpaper that we folded up to try to get the corner sanded. And it became a problem, and it slows the production down, and sanding is a big part of that. So when they came out with the 3x4, we started using a film back sheet on the 3x4. And the reason we went to film is because on a round sander, you know, the edge wear for a disc, and it generally we try to stay off the sides of the wood with the disc, but it does hit it. With a 3x4, because we're going in the corner, it's almost virtually impossible to not, if you want to get into that corner, to not take that film sheet into there. And when we do that, we don't want to have abrasives falling off, or we don't want to have any shedding. And the film is a flatter surface, so it gives us a much flatter sand. With that said, the film sheets on a 3x4 sander, a 3x4 sander is a fixed rotation sander. So it's not a random pattern. It's just a straight orbit, as I call it. And I know that makes no sense, but it's just orbiting. When we try to put just the sheet on the sander actually vibrates really, especially on center panel, will vibrate really bad. And it'll catch and it'll shoot the sander across, and it'll leave us a long line of swirls and pigtails and ugly looking sanding marks. I've had a lot of people talk to me about the center panels and the sheets, even the film sheets. One of the big problems is that they're not using the pad saver. The pad saver almost acts like a shock absorber. It's really crucial in using that pad saver with a sheet. Now, with that said, we need to remember that if we use the foam abrasives that we'll talk about later, we have to take the pad saver off. It doesn't fit between that. You'll get some slippage, and we don't want that. But we have to have it with the sheets because we need that shock absorber. On the bottom left is the interface pads that Curtis was talking about. There's two different types. There's a 7mm, it's a little bit denser, and then there's a 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch I like to offset, and the reason I use a 1/2 inch is on the deep crown molding.
When you say offset, Sherry, what do you mean?
When you could take the interface pad and bring it up to the front of the sander and go off the sanding pad or off the backup pad about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, right?
So it's hanging over the edge.
Right. So it's going to wrap up on the edge of the sander. And what that does is in a deep cove molding, so like the new wood covers over the stove, you know, the hoods.
Range hoods. Yep.
Yeah, those range hoods, they have the deep cove molding now that's really nice around it. What we see sometimes is we'll see some molder marks from when that's cut. And to get that out, you can't really get that out with a sanding sponge. You have to go back to a coated abrasives. And we have not, and all those little knives need to be able to work in unison. When we go off of this, I know we talked about not tipping the sander. This is one instance that you can actually rocker it in. And because of the softness of the interface, the 1/2 inch interface pad, it allows us to rocker it in and not dig into the wood. On the 7mm, I like to use it on the sides where we have profiles on the door. I'll offset it to the side just enough to where I don't have the backup pad bumping into the wood and damaging the wood. And it'll still have that same rotation, and I can ride that profile and sand that really nice and get in that way. And it just makes it for a lot easier to handle situation.
Thank you. I saw a few people raise their hands. We're going to certainly answer questions, but the best thing to do would be to type it. Unfortunately, I can't hear anybody, or I would certainly address it with you verbally. But if you would please type your questions, and we will be answering those at 2 different places during the presentation. Okay, swirl marks, and I love this picture, Sherry, up in this top right-hand corner. That's a great shot of a swirl mark. And we all know that swirl marks is probably the #1 problem, the #1 defect and reject that people find. And so many times they don't even see it until they stain. Tell us a little bit about what we can do to reduce swirl marks. And then more importantly, is there anything we can do if we see them to get rid of them?
Yeah, the picture is perfect. It almost looks like one of the swirls that we see when the sander grabs and skips across the surface like we were just talking about. I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago about hand sanders and the different types of fixed rotation, random orbitals, and why they operate like they do and what we use generally. On wood, like we talked about in that webinar, it's a 5-inch or a 6-inch random orbital. They run at 12,000 RPMs. We need 90 PSI, 3.2 cubic feet per minute. And the reason those are important is because we have to have that sander running at the optimal RPMs for it to be able to sand without leaving swirl marks like this. So when we come in, I always check to see, do we have 90 PSI going to our sanders? Okay, that's good. How fast are our sanders running? With a hand sanding tool, with a random orbital sander, it's rated at 12,000 RPMs. If you drop between 10 and 12, you're okay. Once you get below 10 and you slow that rotation down, it's going to drag. It's going to drag the abrasive across the surface, and it's going to cause sanding marks like what we see. And those are, once you get into stain, if we stained a door like this, it would be so obvious to everyone that picked it up. So we have to find a way to get rid of them or to prevent them. One of them is teaching proper sanding techniques. One of them is going to hook and loop versus PSA. But if we get them, how do we fix them? And that's kind of what we've discussed with some of the finish guys, the finish managers at the end. And one of the things that we found was on the 3x4 sander. You can't do it on a 5-inch because a 5-inch has the random pattern. But on the 3x4, we have that fixed rotation. So you have a gray and a maroon, and both of them are fit to the 3x4, and they have hook and loop on the back. And it's important because you have to have them attached to the sander. You don't want them slipping around on it because it'll cause problems. But if you have the hook and loop pad hook on to the sander, you can run over these sanding marks and you can knock them down and you won't see them in the stain. I use the maroon more so when I see heavy sanding marks, like something like this. I would go to maroon. It's about a 320 grit, and it's going to knock them down and take them and mask them really well. If it's small sanding marks, if you've got an orbital sander back there and your pad is leaving just some little fingernail marks, then I'll try the gray, which is about a 600 grit silicon carbide, because we don't need it to be as aggressive. We just want to take them down where we don't see them. We went into a finish shop not too long ago, Curtis and I did, and one of the guys was questioning whether or not this would affect the color. So we actually side by side sanded and sent them to color. And the ones we ran the non-wovens on, the color was much brighter and prettier. We had no blotchy color at all with that door. And it was amazing to see how they could not even find where we had seen the swirls before. So it's a great tool if you are seeing swirls in your finish.
And folks, I'd just like to say, if you don't take anything else from this webinar, this is a hidden gem of a recommendation here. Like I said, I've been in this 28 years. I just found out about this and how well it works when Sherry showed me that. And again, it's got to be a 3x4, but get with your supplier if you're having a lot of swirl mark issues. Maybe you can't get rid of them, but this is an excellent tip for how to at least mask them so that you won't see them. And I'm telling you, it works. I watched it for myself many times. I'm going to run through this part real quick. It's applications for each grit. Usually in 40 to 60 grit, you're calibrating rough lumber, you're stripping paint, you're sanding severe defects in the wood. So all in all, you're calibrating, you're leveling and trying to get rid of the deeper defects. This is typically usually much easier done on a wide belt sander or even a little drum sander. But again, a lot of people don't have that equipment. So if not, you can do it by hand with a DA or random orbit sander. Just keep in mind, that's what 40-60 grit is going to do. It's for removing serious stock removal. 80 grit is extremely popular, one of the most popular grits in sanding. It is often the starting grit for hardwoods. It removes medium to shallow scratches very well, saw blade burns, other defects. And it is a stock removal grit that will definitely get you started as far as getting some of the deeper defects out. 120 grit at Uneeda is still considered a stock removal grit. And the reason we say that is there's not very many species of wood or other substrates that you can sand with a 120 and go to finish with it. So to us, it's still calibration, and it's a good starting grit for softwood. Sometimes you don't need as coarse a grit as like 80 to remove the marks in the softwood because it's, you know, it's softer. It's going to come out a lot easier. We get into finishing grits starting at 150. And the reason we consider that a finishing grit is there are lots of species that you can come right out of a 150 grit sand and go to finish, whether it's stain or paint. So you see I have 150, 180 put in there together. That's because it's kind of up to you and your experimentation and what you find works best. It's probably 50-50 where we see people finishing after a wide belt sand, for instance, or if they're trying to remove cross grain. Some people do it 150, some 180. Some use a combination of both. 150, 180 is going to remove raised wood grain fibers, just minor surface irregularities, handling scratches, things of that nature. It could be your final grit to go to finish with. And it's for prepping wood stain, and paint. That's actually paint, unfortunately, I misspelled it, apologize. On the 220 grit, very much similar. It's going to prep for wood, for stain and paint. It's often the last grit you'll use. It's rare you'll go beyond 220 with a hand sander before you go to finish. 320 grit is a perfect grit for sanding in between coats. We see people vary between that and 400 grit. And now 320 is a very good starting grit for raw MDF. And you're probably thinking, are you crazy? It's mighty fine. But keep one thing in mind. When you're sanding wood, your whole objective is to open that grain up nice and even to get good penetration and get good stain. You're going to want to violate our rule of not creating heat when it comes to MDF, because you want to absolutely create heat. With MDF, it's like a sponge. If you don't burnish it, it's going to suck up so much finish, it's just going to break you. So on MDF, we do want heat. And so 320 is a good starting grit because it's going to create a lot of friction, and it's going to really help burnish that MDF. 400 grit, sanding in between coats, very common grit, whether it's in cut sheets or on a machine or on a wide belt sander for that matter. It's very common. 600 plus, not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because it's typically not used that much in the woodworking industry. It's great for prepping for polish on different substrates, metals, things of that nature. Sometimes in wood, you will get into finer grits, 600 and above. If you're doing polyester finishes, you may need to rub that out with a very, very fine wet dry paper. And solid surface, certainly, if you're going to a high polish, you'll definitely get into grits well above 600, sometimes as fine as 2,000, 3,000 grit. I'm going to look now, see if we have any questions. It's a good point to look. We do not, so we're going to plow right ahead. If I can get this to move. Okay, the next section of the webinar today is going to be on foam abrasives. We're going to talk a little bit about single-sided sponges, four-sided sponges, two-sided sponges, and also a relatively new product on the market. It's only been out a few years now, and that's Velcro-backed sponges. Sherry, fill us in on single-sided sponges if you would.
No problem. Single-sided sponges were one of the first sponges that came out years and years ago. Recently, I was in a large OEM and they were cutting them down to fit in a certain profile. Up until that point, I probably would have told you I wouldn't have any in my box, but I did see a definite need for them. Their line was moving pretty quick and they were trying to get into this intricate profile, and they were able to cut it and hold it in a certain way in their hand to be able to get into that. But they are good in the sense that you can get into areas where you need your fingertips to push down. They can be quartered and they can be, halved. There's a lot of different ways you can cut them up and use them. They reduce the cut through on the edges. They come in, various amounts of grit. Fine and 100 grit is about the same. The 120, it's similar, but we're in the same ballpark. But these are all the grits that are where they'll go is fine, 100, 120, 180, 220, super fine, and microfine.
Thank you. Four-sided 1-inch blocks.
Four-sided blocks. again, goes back to the original design of sanding sponges. One of the deals was when we first started with sanding sponges was they allowed us to scuff sand without cut through. This square sander, the square sponge, allowed us to hold it in our hand and go corner to corner, kind of what we were talking about. Took a lot of arm motion, a lot of shoulder and elbow grease, but you were able to then sand inside a door and get into profiles. I see a lot of times that people, rather than throw them away, they'll wrap paper around them. But really and truly, the best way to use them is by using the grain that's applied to the sponge. Again, medium, medium fine, fine, very fine, super fine. They come in a variety of different grains and grits.
And I know you love the two-sided foam. Tell us a little bit about that.
The two-sided foam is my favorite. It's the only one I carry in my box. I carry the brown. You've got a couple of different options. You've got a brown aluminum oxide, the black silicon carbide, the white aluminum oxide now that's out. Years ago, we had some trouble with black grain getting into white paint when the white paint really got popular. We had some complaints that when they were finishing, they would see they'd find black specks of the grain where it shed into the paint. So we had to think outside the box and kind of come up. We went with a white aluminum oxide. We won't see that in the paint. And as we've progressed from solvent-based sponges to solvent-free, and we've adapted new resins and new bonding systems with the grain and the foam, we've reduced shedding almost to a nil, and it's getting better every time we come out with a new sponge. But these are really awesome because you can use them in your hand. They're very flexible. You can wrap them around the sides of the doors and run them down the sides of the doors with minimal cut through. I like the 180 grit. I've seen people use 120. We've got a few people that use 150, 220. So it's kind of where you're comfortable with. I like the idea that you don't have any grain on the edges. We can use it to shove into areas where we don't want to sand.
Perfect. The next part we're going to talk about, our objective with these webinars are really to educate people. We're not, our objective here is really not to sell you something, but we're going to use our brand name on this particular item just because it's relatively unique and it's the best way to differentiate between this and a regular sponge. So this is going to be a section on EKASILK Plus, which is sponges with Velcro back. Sherry, can you fill us in a little bit about these? We're going to talk about the flexible properties of it. It allows for automation. There's 3 densities and then there's 7 grains available. And we'll start, Sherry, with the grain and bonding.
Right. And one of the first things I do when I walk into any cabinet shop, or furniture shop, any woodworking shop, is I usually talk to the finish guy. The reason I do that is because he's the last guy to see your product go out the door. He sees the defects coming into him. He has to fix whatever's come off of the Y belt line or whatever. And he usually leads me in the right direction of where I need to go, whether it needs to start with the hand sanding, the Y belt sanding. But one of the things that I've always asked is, what's your bottleneck? What's your biggest holdup in the finish room? And it's almost always hand sanding. And the reason being is because most of it is done by hand. We had the foam abrasives in the past, and everything was done, like I said, with elbow grease. With the introduction of EKASILK Plus, it's allowed us to put it back on the tool and speed that process up. What makes EKASILK Plus so good and why it lasts so long is got a lot to do with how it's made. You can see in the picture, you can see that bonding piece is stretched. That is actually the face or the top of the foam sponge. And it's actually a stretchable latex skin. It's made with a red ceramic AO. We've got a resin bonding system with it, and it allows it to stretch a little bit and move with the abrasive, move with the wood and with the sander, and it opens that wood up so it doesn't lock that sanding dust in between each grain, causing that abrasive to load. If the abrasive starts to load, you can blow it out with an air hose. I run it sometimes on the side of my pants. If you've ever seen my jeans, you'll know I have big sanding marks on the side of my jeans, because I'll hit the sander on the side of my jeans and run it a little bit, and it loosens all that dust up and it gets it out of the way. And then I can go back to sanding. So there's a lot of different ways to clean out, but the point is this stuff will last up to 40 times longer than a conventional abrasive sheet. So if you're using, 25, 30 sheets to sand your job, you can do this with one pad. And that's the beauty of this product.
We did have a question come up. I want to go ahead and take it. This is from Doug Pissick, and he sent this out to the whole group that's watching, in case anybody has any advice. Now, anybody that doesn't know Doug, I know Doug, have had the pleasure of meeting him, and he is quite the artist. I mean, he makes some beautiful wood artwork. And here's Doug's question, and Sherry, just if you have anything to throw in, or if anybody else has any advice as well, but I will tell you, he does some extremely high-end stuff. His question is, for art pieces he makes out of wood, he'll sometimes sand down to ultra-fine grits like micro mesh, which is 12,000 grit, and then cover it with an oil finish. So he's not staining anything, he's oil finishing. And Doug says this allows him to get a very smooth, glossy finish using oils. He's asking, what is the finest grit produced, and do we have any insight or thoughts about this process? And Doug, I will tell you, as far as I know, we're very familiar with micro mesh, and we do convert it into belts, disc, and things of that nature. As far as I know, it goes to 20,000 grit, and you're pretty unique in this business and what you do. Not a lot of people are obviously doing that type of high-end finishing, but Sherry, do you have any other recommendations other than what Doug's doing now as far as oil finishing and going that fine?
No, in fact, Doug, I'd like to come work with you.
He's good.
I'd like to see. That's no, actually, no. Micro mesh is, like you said, it goes to about 20,000 grit. I think is about the finest, and that's about the only thing that I would even recommend for something like what you're doing. Curtis, it is a question down there too in the question and answer box too.
Okay. Okay. Well, what is red ceramic, Sherry? That's from Muhammad Mom.
What it is that it's a brown aluminum oxide with a red ceramic coating, and it's what we see with ceramic generally, like in belts and some of the other products on a coated abrasive, is ceramic lasts. It's the hardest grain to fracture. It's why we use it on metal. But what we get with ceramic is we get the longevity. The problem is that when we put it on a coated abrasive, we can never fracture it, and it ends up causing almost like plowing a field. We cause really deep RARZ finishes. If you could look at it under a microscope, you would be able to see the difference in the width of the scratch. So, but when we coat the aluminum oxide, which does fracture with a red ceramic, it gives us the longevity, and it stays in place for the most part for the general part of the sanding process, but it gives us the longevity, but it still has the fracturability of the aluminum oxide.
So basically it's almost like an additive, almost like a steration, except it's the other route in that it's harder.
Right.
And it's just an additional coating.
Okay. Right. And it protects us to give us a little bit longer life, because as we sand with a foam abrasive, the grain recedes, and that's been from the beginning. It'll recede into the foam. And so you get a much softer scratch, which goes into the next slide, gives us a much softer scratch than what the actual grain size is on the abrasive. Well, that's been one of my things with our EKASILK Plus, is that we don't actually produce, or put out what grain size is on the product. And the reason we don't is because people get confused and they'll ask for a 180 grit, but really they want a 180 grit finish, which is a medium fine sponge, and that may not correlate with the 180 grit grain that's on the product. That may correlate more with like the super fine or the ultra fine finish. But you can see we do, 60 grit is coarse, medium 120 to 150, medium fine 150 to 180, fine 220 to 240, very fine 320, 400, super fine 400, 500. We've added the ultra fine, which is a 600 to 700 grit scratch. These come in 3x4, 3 2/3 by 7, 3-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 11-inch on the pneumatics for the gym sander, the 11 inches for the gym. The electric sanders, 3x4, 3x8, 3-inch, again, 5-inch, 6-inch. So they're available in a wide variety of sizes, and then the grits that you see here. But keep in mind that when you're sanding with a sanding sponge, we're looking at finish sanding. So we are looking at in between coats, primer, sealer, that type of sanding. There's only a couple of applications that you can actually take the foam on white wood, and we'll talk about those when we get to each individual.
So basically what you're saying, for instance, on a medium, if your scratch depth is 150, you're still not going to get that aggressive removal that you would get out of the coat.
You will not. It's not operating in the same manner with the same force that a coated abrasive will.
Perfect. Okay, Sherry, if you would, these next few are going to be the different densities. So fill us in on these, please.
All right. The 1/2-inch pad is the most flexible that we have. In the past, you'd see them, and one of the easiest way to sell this product for anyone is to get a piece of crown molding, put the 1/2-inch on there, slap it on the sander, and you go to town. And the reason being is it's conformable. So it conforms to the flutes on that crown molding or on the door molding, chair molding, whatever it is. You can use it on a chair, leg. I've seen them use it in many different ways, and it just conforms around it, and it allows you to sand that. The medium, which is what we just talked about, is perfect on white wood or raw wood for removing light molder marks. And when I say that, I mean extremely light. If you've got any knife marks, it's not going to take it out. You can go back to the course. We still can't get enough aggressive scratch to take that out. You've got to have the coated abrasive, which operates more like knives, to take that out. But the 1/2-inch on light molder marks it works perfect.
And I'm assuming this is the least aggressive of all the densities that we have.
It is the least aggressive, but it can be the most friendly to use because of the way it conforms, right? The big problem with it is that on crown molding, again, I reiterate this every time I show it, is that if you're going to stain, you cannot run this on sealer because you will cut through. So okay. Keep in mind, this is great for primer. It's great for raw wood, for removing molder marks and such, but we have to go back to hand sanding when we go to a sealer.
Okay. 5 millimeter.
5 millimeter. This pad was one of the first ones to come out. It is perfect for flat sanding. In between coats, you can sand sealer with the superfine and not cut through, as long as you don't shove the sander down and wrap an edge. That's key. But it will ride the rails and stiles of a door perfectly. And as long as you're not using a lot of pressure, you won't cut through with the superfine. The medium and the fine, very fine, that is our main grits, but it is available in all 7 grits that we have.
Okay, perfect. And one thing I will point out, folks, as Sherry goes through these, is every one of these densities, if you go to our website at sandpaper.com, uneeda.com, we have quite a library of videos, and almost every one of these, there's actual live demonstrations showing you how to use each density and what the applications are. And there'll be more of that to come as well. And the 10 millimeter, Sherry?
The 10 mil is the newest part of the family. We designed it initially when the shaker door came in. We started to see with the 5 mil that people were either sanding extremely fast or they were not setting the pad directly straight on the sander. And what was happening was a sander backup pad was actually hitting the wood and it would leave a mark. So we started to have some complaints about that, and we came out with the 10 mil. It's the same density, meaning it's the same thickness, or not thickness, but feel or compressed foam as the 5 mil. And it's totally opposite of the 1/2 inch. It will not conform. It will actually roll an edge. So it's thicker, but it's denser. And so we designed this one to drop in on a shaker door and go corner to corner, and it keeps the sander above the wood. What we found out, though, through using it, was on a hanging line where we're taking the sander to the door or to the workpiece, where before we would get vibration and the sander would skip across. With the 10 mil, we don't get that. Again, it's almost like having a shock absorber. It absorbs that and allows us to sand flat. The other thing that I've noticed using the 10 mil versus the 5 mil is that on the rails and stiles on the doors, a lot of times, if you're not paying attention as the day we move through the day, our wrist gets, lax, and you'll start to kind of roll on the edge of it, and you'll kind of let that pad roll over and cut through on the edge. With the 10 mil, with the density, for whatever reason, it tends to sit more prominent, and it's harder to get it to roll over there. So it actually sits flatter. I've actually gone a lot to the 10 mil because I see new people and people that aren't really used to sanding with it, with the 5 mil. When they start that, I'll move them over to the 10 mil just so that it'll remind them to keep that sander flat. And again, we can run medium, fine, all the way through. The other application that we found with this was on a really fast moving flat line. We introduced the medium fine a few months ago, and we were not getting as aggressive of a scratch with the fine as we needed. And it was because of the speed of the line and because how many parts was going through and how they had to sand and reach over. With the medium fine, it gave us the aggressive grit that we needed to make that scratch to be able to get a good adherence on the next coat.
And I will say, I happen to be fortunate enough to be present at that testing. And folks, that's when it really came, I became a believer. When we say 40 times the life, this was a really good test, and it was about 40 times the life. So that's a true testament there. EKASILK Plus 5 and 6 inch, Sherry, for sanding solid surface, I think, some here and some other applications.
Yeah, we've actually developed the solid surface steps, and we will get into that at a webinar a little bit later down the road. But I use this a lot on the 5-inch sander for refrigerator panels, side panels, anywhere where I have a big flat sheet. And the reason being, the 3x4 is great. We have the 3 2/3 by 7. That's a bigger footprint. But for the easiest sand, and for not having to want to put, multiple sanders in a finish room, you're going to have the 3x4, you're going to have a 5-inch. With the 5-inch, you've got the random pattern. The disc lasts just as long as the 3x4 sheets, and we can move with a swift motion through these refrigerator panels just by using that sanding pattern that we talked about, going side to side, up and down. And it's going to give you a lot more uniformed, even scratch. Now, this is the 5 millimeter that you see on there. We also do this in a 1/2 inch. And I wasn't a big fan of the 1/2 inch disc till I started doing, wooden chairs where we needed to contour to some of the dips and the different profiles in the chairs and different profiles that you see every day, like on tables and such. And using the 1/2 inch, we have to step up a grit because we need to get a little bit more aggressive than we do with the 5 millimeter, because the 5 millimeter isn't, that dense foam allows it to grab a little bit better. The 1/2 inch, it recedes. But with the 1/2 inch, we can step up to a medium and get a nice, really nice uniform scratch on a chair seat or any type of profile that you're trying to get to.
We have an interesting comment. It was perfect timing from anonymous attendee. It says it's also perfect for sinks made of solid surfaces, and that's a perfect comment, anonymous. And I hope you'll join us on the next webinar or the one after the next one, because it's going to be all about solid surface. And a lot of these sponged Velcro back sponge products are very good for sinks and getting into the bowls.
1 second, just to play off of that comment, the 3-inch, the 5-inch is great. But you'll hear me talk about this in solid surface, the 5-inch, when you drop a bowl in or a sink into a solid surface, one of the problems that they have is that on a 5-inch, you only hit the 2 edges of it. And so we have a 3-inch, and we mirror, and you'll hear that with the solid surface webinar, we mirror the scratch with the 3-inch and the 5-inch. So the 3-inch just gives us allows the sander to be flush on all the way around that and blend it a little bit better.
Anonymous is also asking, is it available with multi-holes or only normal hole patterns? We stick to normal hole patterns on the foam products. We certainly have multi-hole dies, but the reason being is it's just with this, all the give you get out of a sponge product, it's just almost impossible for us to punch a multi-hole. And we have done quite a bit of experimentation and done a lot of this myself. And I actually didn't start doing it with 5-inch. I took a 4-inch. And I didn't do it with the foam back product. I was testing it with just coated. I just wanted to get an idea. And so I did not see any additional dust extraction coming from a multi-hole 3x4 sheet, which has, you know, I don't know how many holes, several small holes, compared to a simple 4-hole. Because you have to remember, as you're sanding, you are moving the sander around, and you should have very good success with taking the dust away. And if you look, I know somewhere, and I don't know if it's been posted yet, but Sherry actually herself has done a lot of experimentation with this. And I believe she does have a video that will, you know, physically show you the removal of the dust with a simple 5-hole. Is that correct, Sherry, if I'm not?
Yeah, and also with punching multi-holes on foam, you got to remember that it is a foam backed abrasive. So to punch a multi-hole as small as those holes would, as we'd sand, the foam would collapse in on itself, and you'd get no suction through there. It would actually close up because the hole is so small that the foam would collapse within itself. So there would be no way to keep it open. You would actually get a better draw. You're going to get a better draw off of a 5-hole anyway. But, you know, just keep that in mind, that because the foam is a little bit flexible and moves around a little bit, it does actually, it'll close up on itself on a small hole.
And I don't want to, you know, I know a lot of people have different methods and preferences. In my opinion, I just think that kind of the hole patterns have gotten a little crazy in our industry. You know, unfortunately, a lot of things are developed because of marketing, and, you know, and it's fine. I mean, that's part of doing business. But I honestly think that sticking to the regular 5-inch 5-hole, 5-inch 8-hole, 6-inch, you know, 6-hole, just the traditional patterns, we so far really haven't found a big advantage to going to multi-hole products. And keep one thing in mind: every time you punch a hole in that disc or that sheet, that's less abrasive you got to work with. We want to give you as much abrasive as we can, and fewer holes there. So, Sherry, anything else on these?
Nope, I think that's it.
Okay, that concludes our webinar on Hand Sanding 101. We hope you'll join us on June 30th for the second part of this series, where Sherry will certainly be quite involved in that. And she will be getting much more into deeper parts of the finishing and how you can really get that ultimate finish. I want to check. It looks like we had another question come in. Bear with me a second here. Have you tested EKASILK with a stearated coating? And that's from Anonymous. You know what? I'm not even sure. Sherry, is this stuff even made?
No, there would be no reason to add a stearate. The stretchable latex is different than what a stearate. A stearate actually protects a coated abrasive. So it actually, when we add a stearate, it's to dissipate the dust away and to reduce the loading on a coated abrasive. With the way this is designed, it's actually a stretchable skin, and so it actually dissipates the dust on its own, which is one of the reasons why we went with the red coated ceramic AO. It actually dissipates the dust and it moves it away, and we have the longevity of the grain.
Perfect. Well, listen, if anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly at curtishicks@uneeda.com. Sherry's always welcomes your questions at sjessen@uneeda.com. If you want to see all of our old webinars, they're going to be at www.sandpaper.com/past-webinars, and hopefully they will be there for eternity. So you can watch our whole 6-part series. Don't miss part 2 on Tuesday, June 30th, Sanding for the Ultimate Finish. I want to shout out again to Alan Bopart, who's put all of this together. We really appreciate all the work Alan's put into this, and we really feel like it's been a valuable thing to our customers. We hope you'll watch the next 2 that are left. And always come visit us at www.uneeda.com. Excellent resources there. Lots of good videos, lots of good educational information. I hope everybody's safe, and we hope you have a great rest of the week. And thank you so much for joining us. Sherry, thank you so much for being with us. We really learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.